The Raspberry Pi 4 was recently released, and this is the latest addition to the Raspberry Pi family. Let's take an in-depth look at the Raspberry Pi 4 so you'll understand the new features of the hardware. At the end of this video, we will also compare and contrast the Raspberry Pi 3 and the 4 so you'll understand the differences between the two boards. The very first thing you should be aware of is that there are three options when it comes to the amount of RAM you can have with the Raspberry Pi 4. The versions available for you to choose from are the 1GB, 2GB versions, and a 4GB version. In addition, there have been some changes to the HDMI ports in the Raspberry Pi 4. It now has two HDMI ports, and they both support 4K displays, so you can connect two 4K displays at the same time to a Raspberry Pi 4. These are micro HDMI ports, so the HDMI cables are a little different from the standard HDMI cables. The power port is also different in that you now have a USB-C type power supply connection that you need to make. A good quality 2.5 amp power supply should be used for the Raspberry Pi 4. The Pi 4 now comes with gigabit Ethernet support and has onboard wireless networking, of course, and the Bluetooth capability. It has also upgraded USB capacity and now has two USB Type 2 ports and two USB Type 3 ports. The USB 3 ports transfer data up to 10 times faster. The processor is a Broadcom quad-core processor, which is 64-bit and clocks in at 1.5 GHz. This is of course the fastest processor to date on the Raspberry Pi family. So let's take a look now at the differences between the Raspberry Pi 3 and the Raspberry Pi 4 to see how these two pieces of hardware stack up against each other. First, the Raspberry Pi 3 has a 1.2 GHz quad-core 64-bit processor, while the Raspberry Pi 4 has a 1.5 GHz processor, so a little bit faster here. From a memory perspective, the Raspberry Pi 3 only comes in a 1GB version, whereas the 4 has three options: 1GB, 2GB, or 4GB. From an Ethernet perspective, the Raspberry Pi 3 has 100 base Ethernet, whereas the 4 has support for gigabit Ethernet, much faster networking capabilities. Raspberry Pi 3 has 4 USB Type 2 ports, whereas the Pi 4 has two USB Type 2 ports and two USB Type 3 ports. From a display perspective, the Pi 3 has one full-size HDMI port, whereas the Pi 4 has two micro HDMI display ports with 4K support. Finally, from a power perspective, the Pi 3 has a micro USB power source, whereas the Pi 4 has a USB Type-C power support. So there you have it. The Raspberry Pi Foundation continues to upgrade and improve various versions of the Pi, and if you're starting this course, I would highly recommend you buy a Raspberry Pi 4, as that would give you the best performance, and you can also utilize the new hardware features to build very robust projects. Throughout the course, I'll use both a Raspberry Pi 4 and a Raspberry Pi 3, but all the projects and activities can be done with both.